Lovely. Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you very much. My first 2 or 3 questions are for the department, and then I'll just go through them. Look, I think it's important, and I suppose all of us would have had concerns, and I think particularly through COVID, we would have seen, when you see figures of something like 1,200 people being taken into wardship since the Act in 2015, and yet because of this slow pace, various levels of decision-making support are not operational, and maybe we could come back on that. Wardship is, in my own opinion, a blunt instrument, and I think we all do agree it is very important that this be replaced by a new framework of support aligned to a person's need. So while it is disappointing that this is taking so long, and I suppose that was my biggest issue, it is welcome that we are seeing real progress. I think the guidance from the President of the High Court regarding vaccines and wards, together with the memo from the HSE, was a welcome development in terms of assisting healthcare professionals in approaching the matter of consent. I had a lot of this now during COVID, and so when it comes to this important, and it's a public health measure, that was an issue that I would have seen, and lots of families would have come to me over vaccines during the COVID. So, and maybe you might speak to me on that too. One of the things I want to ask you about is, can you go through the costs if possible? I would have concerns regarding the costs involved, which aren't guaranteed under this legislation. So if you look at medical card holders, would be covered for any costs related to supporting documentation by doctors. But what about those without a medical card? Have we a plan to make this affordable? The report entitled Mind the Gap, compiled by researchers at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy at NUI, Galway's Institute for Life Course and Society, commissioned by the Ombudsman for Children office, said the supports offered under the Assistant Decision Making Act apply only to adults, even though children and young people with disabilities might also benefit from specific and tailored decision-making supports, especially during this transition from childhood to adulthood. So have you, is there any update on this, within the Act? Is this something being discussed, especially when you look at a child that is going from child into adult? And then my last question is, and I know this has been brought up on the mental health, but can I ask now if this bill will address the system right now where we have people who are detained in hospital for mental health treatment without a legal right to have their advanced wishes about treatment respected? So look, they're the bulk of my questions. The first ones are for the department, then Professor Flynn in NUI, and then of course then Miss Anne Flynn under the Mental Health Commission. So thank you very much again for this information, and this is really important that we try and get through this as quick as possible and get this through. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deputy. So we'll start with either Carol or Niall from the department.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Deputy. We share your view that wardship does need to be abolished as soon as possible, and we currently have priority drafting, a lot of work being done on the amendment bills. So we think it is very important to meet the June deadline in the interests of the relevant people who really we believe very strongly will benefit from this legislation. In terms of the costs, there's very much a commitment that this is going to be accessible. The costs aren't absolutely finalised, but they'll be low. I mean, that's been one of the riding concerns of the department, that this will be the case. So the services of the Decision Support Service will be open and accessible to everybody. That's very much the case. In terms of why the legislation is for adults rather than for children, and we of course recognise that children have complex needs, but the situation is that children have a radically different situation in terms of guardianship than adults. You know, when you're under 18 at the moment, you are normally under the guardianship of your parent or another adult. So you don't have the same rights in terms of decision-making autonomy that an adult would. An adult isn't ordinarily under guardianship. So that was why there was very much the sense when the 2015 Act was being developed that the rights of adults in terms of guardianship are different. So this legislation is for adults. Perhaps it might be useful just to come back on the consultation point. We see that the pre-legislative scrutiny is absolutely crucial, and we very much welcome the fact that the committee is engaging with disabled people's groups. We see that as a very important part of the process. I suppose we also see this legislation as a continuity with the 2015 Act, and we're very pleased at the time of the development of the 2015 Act that Professor Flynn and indeed Fiona Dwalish were actively involved in the consultation processes. This is very much not new policy. It is the elaboration of the policy that was put in place to guide the 2015 Act, and very much also it's an elaboration of the kind of lessons that have we've taken from the work that the Decision Support Service is doing, that the National Disability Authority has learned in the consultations that it has had. Most recently, a major conference on the convention. So we, in many senses, this legislation is a response and a listening to a long-standing consultation process. But we very much take on board the fact that an easy-to-read version of the bill would be very important. So we will take that away, and we are also very ready to engage with disabled groups to answer any queries that they may have in terms of the legislation. As Anya Flynn has said, there are certain provisions that we're continuing to work on, including in relation to detention matters, and if possible to bring forward committee stage amendments, including to allow the advanced healthcare directives to be applicable to people who come under the Mental Health Act 2001. I hope that's useful, Deputy.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Cliona, I see you're indicating to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, if I could just come in on the point raised by the Deputy around the Mind the Gap report and around the applicability perhaps of the Assisted Decision Making Act to those under the age of 18. Our thinking behind some of the comments in that report, and indeed how we think in our submission to the committee recently, was predominantly around the area of healthcare decision making and how currently under the law it is broadly understood, although it's a piece of criminal law, that 16 and 17-year-olds can consent to medical treatment, and then this is further reflected in our national consent policy and understood in that sense as well. And yesterday, further witnesses to this committee would have mentioned this in the context of mental health and the needing to provide the additional safeguards in that. So our thinking there was that if we would extend the guiding principles under the Assisted Decision Making Act, for example, and perhaps specific parts of it, such as the advanced healthcare directives, to this age group, that would provide them additional safeguards and upholding their rights and the necessary supports perhaps that they might use in a way that they don't currently have, while they are seen to be able to consent in many instances and may possibly be subject to capacity assessments because the functional test is part of Irish law and case law and possibly in use already. They may not have the presumption of capacity that you find under the Assisted Decision Making Act. They may not have the duty to take all reasonable steps and the other issues that we find in there, which would be very welcome for them. And what we really wanted to do here, and you'll have heard in Professor Finn's opening statement that we're not happy about the functional test and its compliance under human rights legislation. If we are doing it, we want to put as many other principles and safeguards in place as is possible and build this culture of support and empowerment rather than one of capacity assessments.
Thanks, Cliona. I think there was questions there as well for the Mental Health Commission. I'm not sure, is it Anya?
I think it was for Anya, yeah.
Anya, go ahead, Anya. Thanks.
If I might pick up on one point, Deputy, which you raised, and I think Mr. Dwalish has touched on it as well there, and it was your observations around the rollout of the COVID vaccine campaign, which I think was a really interesting illustration of what should be the key precepts of this Act. And it was very encouraging to see the words will and preferences used in the statutory instrument, which give effect to the delivery of the vaccine. And it was a recognition that the preoccupation which can sometimes exist with accessing consent was set aside in favour of ascertaining what a person's will and preferences are. So I think the cultural shift which this Act is part of, is well underway. Just to take up on the practical point around costs, which you mentioned, yes, we've heard very clearly from the Minister that costs shouldn't be a barrier to access to the supports under this Act. And so far as we've been able to influence what costs we charge, we've been concerned that they are minimal and that in fact there will be provision for a waiver of those costs in relation to DSS services. We don't have control, obviously, in relation to other aspects like the costs of going to court, but I think that point is well made, that costs shouldn't be prohibitive. And you've mentioned also, I think it's a relevance probably to the Department of Health, where people have to access specific forms of capacity statement from medical and other healthcare professionals. That's in respect of co-decision making agreements and supporting documentation also around EPAs. We would also like to see assurance that those capacity statements are going to be available and that costs aren't going to be an issue there also. I think those are the two key points I would take from your questions. Thanks, Deputy.